I'm Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick, and I'm a former faculty member here at the School of Public Policy, and I'm currently a fellow at the Center for Media, Data, and Society, and I am a sociologist trained I do work on social movements and have a new project that's now no longer, I can't use the excuse that it's new because it's been around now for about 1.5 years, on new technology. And I'll be talking today about some new technology, some old technology, and a couple of things in between. So, sociologist, I'm now at the School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego, where I live with my family, and we sit around and miss Budapest, so I'm very glad to be here. I want to thank my colleagues and friends at the School of Public Policy and at the Center for Media, Data, and Society for having me here, and to Adlatso, which is, I'm also a principal at something called I guess it's not up here, but the Good Drone Lab, which was a sort of a Think Dewey kind of tank that came out of a project with students here at SPP. I'll talk about that in a short minute. But I want to thank Adlatso, who's not here, but who is a partner in applied ethics, not crime, but I guess it's not crime, but applied ethics that we've pursued with our drone project, and also the Visegrad Fund for funding a series of workshops that we did earlier this week. So thanks to everybody. Before I get started, I want to note something that isn't apparent from this talk, which is that as an educator, almost everything that's come out of this project has been done in tandem with students. And so the origins of this project are actually in a class on human rights advocacy, and we sort of pulled the class to figure out what people wanted to do, what the class should do, something that's applied, something that's cool, something that's fun, and we decided to buy a drone, see if we could buy a drone. Turns out you can, and then do something with it, and it turns out what we decided to do was to use it to estimate crowd sizes. We'll talk about that in a minute. Then when I shifted institutions, I sort of dragged this sort of labby thing with me, and with students at the University of San Diego, we've now actually done another course in which in the class we've done a huge data collection exercise to generate a report. So these are two things that I'm going to be talking about in the talk, but what might not be apparent is that they're deeply collaborative projects and co-authored papers and co-authored reports with graduate students at both institutions. And so this is a kind of a nice moment for me to be presenting later work that actually was born here at the School of Public Policy. So what I'm going to be talking about today is technology for social change, and drilling in particular on one technology. We'll riff on another one, but talking about drones. So one of the first puzzles to sort of tackle when we start talking about drones is to clarify what we mean. The first problem is actually in just that term itself. Are we talking about unmanned aerial vehicles, or we talk about unmanned aerial systems, which are not for transportation, but they're platforms that do things? Do we have a problem with the fact that this is deeply gendered? These are manned aircraft, where we have a gender challenge here. We also have a challenge related to autonomy, because increasingly there's networks of devices that are flying in tandem and in concert without human intervention. So they're flying according to algorithms that have been programmed to do something like fly in a swarm in response to a particular big data event, let's say. There's nothing to stop drones from doing this sort of thing. So at what point do we stop talking about these as manned vehicles or manned systems, even if we could sort of like remove the gender bias in that term? So people have started talking about remotely piloted aircraft systems, but that's, again, there's a pilot, so we lose the gender and we keep the agency in a way that is still fairly problematic. But nevertheless, what people tend to think, especially human rights advocates like myself, I'm a social movement scholar, human rights work, we talk about drones, and this is usually what we mean. We're talking about large fixed-wing devices that have missiles under them that are used by large states, and increasingly now by many, many smaller states, built in the global north, increasingly built all over the world, but really to do one thing, which is targeted killing, and to actually escape other rules and international norms around manned fixed-wing flight in battle space, right? So this is what we tend to think of. I've spent time here trying to talk about drones with a number of sort of OSF and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, and this is what we're talking about in the human rights community when we say drones. I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about small quadcopters, octocopters, devices that are essentially 1, 2, 3 kilos and have the guts of an iPhone pulled apart and jammed inside of them, right? So small form factor, a GPS sort of stabilizer, a camera, pretty basic technology that was high-tech 10 years ago, is not high-tech now. These can be built at home. These can be built in mass. They cost about 1,000 euros. And they get, just like phones, smartphones, they get sort of smarter and smarter and faster and more stable. And whatever feature sets they have, those get better and stay at about the same price point. So if you buy a phone 3 years ago and it can do 4 things, and you buy a phone for the same price a year later, it can do more things, and so forth. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about easily hacked, easily built, off-the-shelf technology that is increasingly available. So when I did this project with a class and we said, let's buy a drone, what we did is we ordered it online. We ordered it from Seattle in the United States and had it shipped here. We could have bought it here. There's nothing sort of regulating that purchase, nothing regulating the transaction or the shipment. So these are readily available. This is the most common device is from a company called DJI, which is a Chinese manufacturer, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Pretty basic device. What's interesting, though, is the question about what the relationship between these two things is. If when people talk, they tend to talk about this, but really when increasingly we start to see things like this, what's it mean? So sat down and did a bit of research on this, coded a bunch of data, and came up with this essential graph, which suggests that, now these are two different things, right? We've got in the blue, with a spike around 2007, we've got an increase in the use of drones in the battle space by President Obama in the United States, and then a decrease sometime later and a spike back up, and this will go back up and down according to sort of foreign policy decisions made by, in particular, the United States. This orange graph is the one I'm most interested in, right? And this is the number of times that these devices right here are talked about in the media, right? And we see this incredible spike in about 2012. And in late 2012, that spike actually crosses militarized use, right? Now, there's no moral equivalencies here. At the other end of each of these events on the blue spike are bodies, right? And at the other end of every one of the uses in the orange line are selfies, right? And bodies and selfies, these are two different, non-comparable categories. So I want to be clear about what the data is here. But what I'm talking about is when we say drone and we talk about advocacy and rights and drones and civil society and open space, we tend to be talking, when I say we, I'm talking about sort of open society, civil society, rights protecting folks like I hope we all are, we tend to be talking about this. And I'm trying to expand this conversation for a number of reasons to start talking about this platform and the way it can be used for civil society and open society purposes. Very briefly, number of key differences here between the way that these two technologies have sort of rolled out and sort of what's inherent, the qualities inherent in the technology. I'm not going to read all this to you, but we can put it up online somewhere, I'm sure, and you can read it later at your leisure, just as nighttime reading, falling asleep. Similarities, both of them live in a legal limbo. It's not clear what's going to happen in terms of their regulation, which I'll talk about in a second. They both operate in new space, airspace that traditionally has had just professional pilots in it. There's all of a sudden a whole host of new actors using that space. There's regulation difficulties because it's not clear how you balance innovation and regulation in a way that's balanced according to each society's needs. And then these key differences. This is basically typologized as, in the era of the Predator, these large fixed-wing devices starting in around 2007 in their use. They're large, used by governments to surveil and kill. They're used in military theaters. They're expensive. They take incredible amount of technological know-how to build and to control, and they have entirely proprietary technology. On the right-hand column, we start to see a familiar story that emerges if you know anything about the sort of open source software movements and anything about the pirate radio. We start to see the absolute opposite of each one of these factors. Open, hackable, DIY-able, 3D printable, open source, and so forth. So here we see the largest set of contrast, which is that one needs to be built in a specialized Lockheed Martin facility, and the other can be built in our kitchens with a 3D printer or using sort of found technology. So the guts of that device I showed you earlier, it's the guts of an iPhone. None of it's regulated, none of it's controlled, and the actual process of putting it together is not regulated or controlled. So here we have another form of technology that is beyond the state's ability to readily and easily curb it and shut it down. This is beginning to happen, but we're not yet at a point where states are able to do this efficiently, effectively, or consistently. So when we talk about these new ranges of use, what are we talking about? This is a flying defibrillator, so you have a heart attack, you come and you can instantly apply it and it shocks the person to life. You could actually tie this in the Internet of Things to the pacemaker. Your pacemaker fails and your manufacturer and their insurer instantly sends this thing out to you, and somebody who's standing next to you screaming then applies this device. It's being used in Rwanda. Zipline just got a lot of press about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they announced a partnership with UPS where they're essentially delivering blood within 30 minutes to anywhere in Rwanda, right? So it's a payload that simply drops, it flies around and it drops the payload and it lands, and then the medical folks come out and get it. And these are in areas that are either inaccessible or very difficult to access during the rainy season. So if you spend any time in Rwanda or in East Africa during the rainy season, it's incredibly difficult places to get to. This device simply goes there cheaply, quickly, rechargeably, solar chargeably, and drops these packets. Another use, this is wildlife poaching. We used to use larger aircrafts, these sort of larger systems to actually get the satellite feed or get the feed from the plane. These are big bits of expensive equipment, which is now something that's backpackable, essentially, by individuals and conservation folks and wildlife conservation sort of officials to monitor and document wildlife trends and populations, right? It can be used to test water. This simply drops a hose down and sucks it up and takes water samples in inaccessible remote areas or where the presence of the testing device would interfere actually with the material you're testing. It can be used for mapping. It can be used to monitor deforestation. This is in Indonesia, where essentially the deforestation monitors from the government monitor this area by floating down the river, which is why the logging concern stripped everything from here and left a nice green swath along the river, so it appears that it's the fully forested area that they're actually monitoring, right? So that's a bunch of anecdotal use, right? There's a bunch of different ways that this technology is being applied, but how much of the world does that represent, right? So we've got this in contrast to militarized use, but how much of the world of sort of, let's say, nonviolent drone use do these anecdotes actually comprise? So I should say this here. So at the University of San Diego, I led a team of students and we analyzed the 15,000 sort of news items that I mentioned earlier, and we culled out the ones that were sort of purposefully used for particular reasons. And then we coded all of this data and we wrote a report. And this is essentially the 3 slides from those findings, which is that this use takes off, just like that spike we saw. That use takes off in 2012, 2013. And we see an increase in use by a whole host of actors. You can't read this. I did that on purpose so you couldn't read it, so I could tell you something. This is government, business, named individual, science and academia. This is civil society, unknown users, and intergovernmental organizations. Intergovernmental organizations are hardly anybody down here, right? And governments are significant, and they've been acting for longer, but they're nowhere near as large as their competitors, right? And so over time, government's portion of the use pie has actually shrunk. It's been a large player for a long time, but its proportion of the use has actually gone down. Where is it being used? I should take this slide down because we did this study in English, and as we're starting to sample in Chinese, we're realizing we're sort of confirming our assumptions about bias in the data. So this suggests that a lot of the use is in English-speaking countries. I wonder why, right? So we're working on this right now, but the interesting thing is that even with this bias, this sort of linguistic bias in the study, we see the same spike in about 2013 and a real increase in a whole set of uses that are non-governmental, non-violent. They're commercial or they're people flying small devices. And what are they using this for? Now, this one you really can't read. 2 things to note. It's all up in 2012, and the one thing I want to direct your attention to is this line right here that goes up and down and up and down. This is civil society usage. This is use by civil society for civil society and for the public good, essentially, right? So we see these larger trends, and in these larger trends, we see civil society actors are using this technology a little bit, but not as much as other actors in our data. So that's the sort of puzzle that I'm trying to tease out in my own work. So what are some exact uses there that I can speak to sort of directly? So one is the use of this technology. At the very beginning of the Drone Lab project, we documented the internet tax protest here in Hungary. I'll show you a little bit of footage and talk over top of it if I can get this technology to work, which I usually can't. So some of you have seen this video already, and I want to say a couple of things about it. The first is that it's the second video that we made. The first video was all drone footage, and it was good, and a lot of people liked it. But essentially, when we took drone footage from crowdsourced footage on the ground from people involved in the protest, right? We essentially were able to amplify the impact of the drone footage. So it was complemented, it was together with other footage. So what I want to note here in the pause is another thing that this project did. Having cameras on the ground allowed us to actually show both the sort of images from the top and the images from the ground in a way that linked them together. And also having a drone in the air actually allowed the actors and activists on the ground to do new things with like found material, right? So I'm a social movement scholar, I like this. How do people demonstrate like their commitment to issues, and how do people demonstrate to the press, we're here, you should listen to us. And in this case, it was actually by people turning their phones up to full brightness and then pointing them up in the sky at the drone, right? Now people turning up their, like lighting their lighters or lighting up their phones, this is like old school concert stuff. This is not rocket science. But there's never been a reason to actually point it straight up at the sky, because there's never actually been anything watching. And so this is just one small example of the way that having a device or a camera in new space starts to shift the way that, in my level of interest, movement actors, but also civil society and social actors start to repurpose particular signals to actually direct it toward like new eyes or new observation figures. So I started to fly a balloon over my campus, and I thought, well, how would I signal what campus we're on? So I asked for a big poster to actually put on the ground, so that once something was overhead, like sort of our device, you could see where you were by looking at the signage that was on the ground. We have no signage on the ground. Nobody has signage on the roofs. These are completely unused spaces. So just for example, we start to move cameras regularly up into the air looking down, and we open up a whole like line of space for all sorts of purposes. And here, it was for activism. Let me see if I can unpause this without messing it up. So the purpose of this protest was actually to protest against the Orban regime's announcement of a €1 per gigabyte tax that would have applied to mobile phones and to businesses and to grandmothers, and this led to outrage, of course, and a series of protests, this being the second of two very, very large protests. So the drone footage, together with Adlazzo, who I mentioned earlier is our partner in crime at the Good Drone Lab, we worked on the footage. They made the video. They released the video on their platform. It was badged with the organization's logo, and it proceeded to get to go relatively viral, considering how many clicks activist sort of videos tend to get. So this is an early success, I think, because ultimately the social movement's demands were met, at least at the rolling back of that initial tax policy. And it led to a number of images that were of this kind of generally symbolic, definitely precedented. This is something we see all the time, and this is not necessarily it's not necessarily something we see all the time, which is where the image is up higher. So this was interesting. The movement, the outcome from a social movement perspective was sort of a leveraged impact. The drone came alongside traditional photography by people on the street, by the press, and sort of amplified a message that was already there. A new tactic was developed, was actually like lifting the cameras up and pointing them straight up. And another thing that came out of this was the drone was able to show the size of the event, right? And this is in an area of I don't know, the public life where there's often differences between the rulers and the ruled, the protesters and those who are challenged, about how many people support a particular claim that a movement is making. Businesses and governments and others who are targeted tend to say hardly anyone was there. And social movements tend to think and say almost everybody was there. And in between are journalists or some sort of impartial observers who are not trained to do this, muddling along and saying, well, we think it was more like, who knows? And so here we had the second question, which was, well, how many people were even at this event? So we thought, well, we think we can use the drone to actually start to do some estimation here that's better than standing on the ground or looking outside the window of a third-story building, right? Looking outside the window of a third-story building is exactly how crowd estimation has been done since the late 60s, when an early adopter of this sort of approach looked out his window in Sproul Plaza in Berkeley and realized there's squares out there. I can figure out how dense people are standing per square and then get an estimate from there. So we simply applied the same logic. We decided, well, there's density, there's a number of squares, right? And we've got the site size. And so we simply laid a grid over top of an image made by a drone at 180 meters, I think, that captures this entire field, and then laid a grid over top of it. Now, we've got a grid over top of it, what do we do next? So we actually developed an estimation methodology that we can give to civil society actors who, with about 20 minutes of training, can apply this method to counting out the grids and doing this estimation and doing the math themselves. So last year, a graduate student and I co-authored and published a study in which we released these findings, and these are too small for you to read, but essentially the media said that there were tens of thousands of people at the event depicted here. Our expert coder, which is my co-author, Tautvydas Druskauskas, who is a graduate student from here, he estimated that there were about 36,000 people there. And when we gave it to graduate students together with this like 10 and 15-minute training exercise, they estimated there were between 37,100 and like 37,600 people there. Very, very close to what we had determined with hours and hours developing a method. We gave it to them for less than an hour, and this is what they determined. This is not like sort of an earth-shattering assessment. The important thing is it can be done in less than an hour with pen and paper to augment sort of the images that come from the device. So in both cases, the drone's not earth-shattering. The drone is coming alongside things that were already there. Traditional journalist images on the ground, here estimates that have been around since the late 60s in terms of how to estimate crowd size. So why does this matter? I mean, does it matter at all? My first answer is something I sort of teased out at the very beginning, which is I feel like the human rights advocates that I live with and are in the sort of my world and familiar space have been looking at how governments use drones, and particularly for targeted killing and increasingly for surveillance. Donald Trump has recommended that there are drones monitoring the US, Mexico, and US Canadian border constantly, which is a minor addition or a minor extension of what's currently happening, which is that they're monitoring the US-Mexico border most of the time, right? So this is already a conversation about both surveillance for these government surveillance and a conversation about their use in the battle space, right? We're starting to have a second conversation about DHL and Amazon and other other companies using this technology, not just sort of to monitor pipelines and to monitor heavy industry, which they're doing right now, but to be in the space that we're in as well, delivering packages and this sort of thing. So this is an ongoing conversation. Human rights actors are having less of a conversation, I think, or a less sophisticated conversation than I would like about the sorts of uses I just described and showed you, right? Are those good? Are those bad? Should we be doing more of that? Less of it? Different kinds of it? That's a conversation I think we're having a little bit less of, and I'm really hoping to encourage more of. This leads to a second question. What about regulations? And so I'm coming from the United States, which is a regulatory environment that I'm more familiar with. And there the debate is really assuming that there's an actor, which is the US government, which won't be regulated, it insists. The second kind of actor, which is commercial actors, which will be regulated. And then there's everybody else, generally, let's say, hobbyists. And it's missing this category, which is civil society use for the purpose of, let's say, advocacy, or for the purpose of animal protection, animal welfare, this kind of thing, right? So that's generally missing, is this third conversation about pro-social sort of civil society drone usage of the type that I'm talking about. So, of course, having that conversation leads to challenges, right? So how do we balance these two things, safety and privacy, with innovation, right? Now, we've seen in a couple of the cases that I've shown that these devices are allowing things that have been done in the past to be done a little bit better, a little bit differently. Maybe it's not so revolutionary, but maybe it's delivering blood faster, right? Or health services faster, or more accurately documenting something we were generally not horrible at estimating previously, right? Tens of thousands to 37,000, I mean, that's ballpark. So maybe we're willing to actually sacrifice some of this innovation in exchange for the safety and some safety and privacy. The challenge is that's not really a conversation we're having when it comes to civil society's use of drones, right? This conversation then plays itself out if we're talking about regulation. So if we're not talking about civil society's use of the technology, we're just de facto not talking about regulation. So for example, on the campus where I now work, there's a memorandum that came out from the school's attorney that said we're not flying drones on campus. And if you probe, it's because the US government has said, if you're going to be flying commercially, you should register. But we're students and we're faculty. So is that a commercial use? And if you ask attorneys this question in conservative environments like universities, the response is, we're not sure, let's not find out, right? And I show them my pay stub and I say, I promise, I'm a non-for-profit. And they don't buy this argument. So essentially what we have is this world where individuals aren't regulated, corporations are beginning to be regulated, and it's not clear where researchers, activists, students, and other civil society actors really fit in the regulatory environment. And this is a really, really important thing, I think, if we want to protect our ability to make determinations and decisions socially about what we think about this technology. We may ultimately decide, going back to here, that we're going to choose in favor of safety and privacy in a number of ways and do without the innovation. That's a fine decision. I would just like it if we made that decision rather than governments made it for us. Another question is how quickly regulation actually happens. This is a real challenge because we're seeing a number of states like, so Kenya, for example, had an agreement with Google that they were going to use drones from Google, or Google's going to work with some organizations to monitor poaching. And just before the project was launched, Kenya passed a nationwide ban on the use of drones for all purposes, right? South Africa did the same thing. They passed a nationwide ban, presumably to wait until larger regulatory actors like the EU and the United States generated precedent-setting regulations, right? But would this have the effect of instantly curbing the surveillance of poachers in Kenya, for example? So there's this larger question about whether or not to regulate quickly or slowly. Do we wait for some things to go right and wrong and then make decisions with better data? Or do we work proactively as societies to really regulate around these couple of challenges that I've already articulated, like privacy and safety? So here's the tension, right? I'm making this statement here, and I make an argument in a number of pieces that having open skies is key to having open society, right? If only corporations and if only governments have access to this new space, then this is a problem for civil society, it's a problem for open society, and it's a problem for larger conversations about power, wealth, and so forth, right? Now, I've argued, and the way that we've used this drone for the projects we had here was for increased accountability and increased transparency. So for example, in footage that I've not shown you, we used the device to actually let's say, surveil the homes of oligarchs who have ill-gotten gains, right? So I'm using the term surveillance intentionally because this is sort of a democratic surveillance. What is this? Right? So I'm not trying to skirt the fact that this kind of investigative journalism, let's say, is something other than what it was, which is looking in places people don't expect to be seen. What do we think about that? That should be a conversation that we're having, right? So I'm arguing it increases transparency and accountability. The question is, in my mind, and this is a puzzle I've been wrestling with most recently, and it'll, I hope, generate some conversation here, is whether or not opening skies to civil society, right, is actually good. Because we actually currently have decreased accountability and transparency when it comes to some of the technologies that we have. So the question is, how do we hold the technologies and the technologists, people like me, to account, right? And I've been challenged with this question for the last year or so. I was given this talk in a number of places, and instantly the first question is, this all sounds really great if I trusted you, right? And since I heard the first part of your talk, I don't trust you. So what do we do there? How do we use these devices in a way that increases trust and accountability simultaneously, such that when you see a device like this, and it's sort of hovering ominously, if you've ever seen a drone, it's just sitting there watching, you don't know who's flying it, what it's doing, or why. How do we actually reverse these lines of accountability? I'm arguing these devices can be used to see things that people who are in power want to be hidden. The question is, how can society see back to us to hold us accountable for what we do with what we see and for the use of this technology, right? So I'm arguing over the course of the last couple of months that one way to hold civil society accountable Can you bring me the bag from the last row? Under you, there's a gray bag. No, under your seat, right under your seat. Under your seat, directly under your seat. What's in it? Can you take out whatever's in it? This is a 30 euro 3D printed gimbal. You can strap 3 GoPros to it, right? And this is a 70 euro GoPro knockoff that straps onto that 3D printed thing. And this is a 2.5 meter balloon. It's a dangerous balloon. It's a dangerous balloon. I was going to say it's innocuous, but it's not. So here's the question, right? If drones are fundamentally unaccountable because they actually are suspended and can be flown out using algorithms and it's not clear where the person is taken off from, which I honestly think is an asset in some contexts. It is. But in other contexts, it's not. So I brought this balloon because I was at a talk, and there was this panel. We can talk about the gender implications of this in a moment. There's a panel, and there were 2 men talking about satellites. And then there was me, another man, talking about drones. And at the end was this woman in development who did community mapping in refugee camps. And she had a balloon. She had the one thing that's got a link that goes from the camera to the ground and connects the thing that does the seeing with the person that's doing the watching. Does this make sense? And so what she would do is do community mapping, walking into the community with this balloon, and she'd have to negotiate access to the places where she walked, because the string and the balloon and the camera on the balloon followed her. And so she had to simultaneously negotiate access at the same time she was securing footage. It's a very different way to think about accountability. Now, one doesn't always want to do this. I would not like to walk through a crowd, a dangerous or violent crowd that I would like to be capturing footage of with my little string. I don't know, somebody cut my balloon. That's my greatest fear, somebody cut my balloon. But there's different uses for these technologies, and this is a fundamentally more sort of accountable technology, right? Physically, I mean, we can just see this here. So I bought this thing, and we started flying it in San Diego, where I work. This is a canister of helium. I told you the prices of all of these things, and I had it come up in a bag because it's this big, and it costs very little, right? The most expensive thing is the helium that it takes to actually fill it up. You have a line of accountability directly to the person who's doing the viewing, the monitoring, the image, and the data capture. And at the end of the day, you actually end up getting footage that's not identical to, not as stable as, but similar to that captured by the kind of quadcopters and octocopters that I started talking about at the very beginning of the talk, right? So this footage was made day before yesterday in front of the US Embassy. We walked right up in front of the US Embassy where we've flown our drone before and launched the balloon. And 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, 4 1,000, 5 1,000, there's the security, right? And if you want in the Q&A, I can tell you what happened there, but we ended up flying the balloon because I showed you the footage, right? So the interesting thing is, just like the drone, sending a camera up higher gives us a new perspective. We're jumping back and forth. This is back to my campus in California. I didn't know that the library was covered in solar panels. I had no idea, right? So this is, again, talking about the way that this opens up new perspectives on space that hasn't been used or monitored or seen. This actually, for better or for worse, opens up these new horizons, vistas, and spaces. So I don't know if you can see this from there, but this is like tying these things all together. This is the camera, and this is a string that goes all the way down to that person right there. Right? So it's a line of sight connection, again, between the device and the people using it. This actual kit itself I bought from a group called Public Lab, and they devised this using trash bags and 2-liter bottles and an old Nikon camera to monitor the onset of oil spillage from the BP oil spill in Louisiana in the Gulf in the United States. It's a completely DIY thing. And this is now the very flashy, very expensive version. 3D printed, this is a 28 euro balloon, right? So my point is, when you talk about drones, right? We're talking about democratizing the air, and we're talking about how we use this open space. And this is an OSF theme, right? This is going back to larger themes about closing public spaces. And I'm suggesting that for environmental advocacy or for protest and for sort of the pro-democracy sorts of movements, space and air is actually a public good, and it's something that should be nurtured and protected, and civil society actors should be part of that conversation rather than leaving it to private regulators. This is that balloon mapping kit that I mentioned earlier, and you just order it and you buy it, and you get these plans, and you're like, how am I going to do this? And you realize that some of these plans are from 1912. The actual system for linking the threads through this to connect the camera to the balloon is from 1912. These are not new technologies, they're appropriate technologies, right? So I called this new technologies, but it really is about new and old or appropriate technologies. So the real puzzle then is if we're going to start doing things like democratizing surveillance, maybe we should or maybe we shouldn't do, but if we're going to have an open skies and open space that's available for publics to access and not just the powerful, then the question is how do we similarly distribute accountability? And I'm kind of like playing with this idea technologically by walking up here like a silly man with a string, but we have to start taking those steps if I say we, I don't know who I mean by we, I've been challenged on this before, who are we? We're open society, obviously. If we want to be taken seriously as we adopt new technologies for the kind of accountability that I'm suggesting we pursue. So do these technologies help reopen public space or reopen the public sphere or add a new area of contestation? I think the answer is yes. And as I've already said about regulation, I think that this is an ongoing conversation that we need to have sort of a more sophisticated role in as civil society actors. I'm going to keep it short and sweet because it's warm in here. You guys are very patient. But this is let me say one more thing. I'm like a fundamentally an optimistic person, right? So when new technology comes out, I'm like, what could that do? And I think some bad things, I think some good things, and then I buy it and then I play. So I'm fundamentally optimistic, which is why I think that most of the technology I've talked about today can be jammed with an umbrella, right? So this is why there's an umbrella at the beginning and the end of this, which is there's all this new technology, and at the end of the day, humans, we're so creative, right? And if I'm completely wrong about the way that this bulb bounces technologically, I think I'm right about how the human ingenuity and creativity when it comes to survival, when it comes to adaptation, and when it comes to sort of making our communities taking control of communities and living the lives that we want to live. So I've just moved here. I've just moved to California, so I'm going to say Californian like this. But that's why I'm ending with this super duper analog umbrella, because I believe in individual and human ability to overcome these sorts of technological problems. So I'm going to end there. Thanks.